But essentially what I'd like to do is first lay out what environmental history is for people who aren't so sure about that as a concept, and then give some examples that I think are pretty useful that you can use with your students that take historical things and raise very contemporary issues that students are going to have to deal with as citizens when they graduate. So that's kind of what the plan is. So the what is environmental history, and just I'm going to be diverging a little bit because I want to comment on the images. I don't like just to have an image and not talk about it a little bit. So this is actually one of the dioramas from the Harvard Forest in Petersham, which is not very far from here, probably about 45-minute drive. And I really recommend that you go to the Fisher Museum and see the whole set of dioramas, which all deal with forest succession. And they also will take school field trips. So it's a very interesting place to learn about the history of forestry in particular. So Donald Worcester, about 25 years ago, came up with this very concise definition about humans affected by the natural environment and conversely and how it goes back and forth, and you can't really talk purely about nature without talking about the way humans have intervened in nature. And of course you can't talk about human history without talking about the natural foundation on which our civilization is built. So there are four aspects to the study, and I'm going to explore them kind of in turn. One of them is the one that's probably the most straightforward, seemingly the most straightforward, and that is how environments have changed over time as a result of their natural processes and their impact on humans. And when we think about that, obviously, think about something like the San Francisco earthquake. Like, humans didn't cause the San Francisco earthquake. This was just a natural event. But clearly it had a big impact on not just the environment of San Francisco, but the whole society and culture and all that. So earthquake is sort of a big one. Floods. And again, this is from the flood that happened in 1938 that followed the hurricane of 1938 that went up the Connecticut River Valley. And again, it's a really interesting project for students. They can research, if you happen to be along the path of the storm, which many of you probably were or are, how their town fared during the hurricane of 1938. Because there's a lot of material on that in local newspapers. You can see this is from the Athol transcript, I guess. Or maybe it's the Worcester, I can't remember which newspaper it was now, because they keep changing ownership. But essentially, it's a newspaper supplement. And you can find a lot of other kinds of material on that. And again, humans didn't cause that hurricane. This is a natural process. And as we go back in history, we see that there's a lot of these natural disturbances that have taken place, whether it's volcanoes erupting or other things. So one aspect of environmental history is to look at that. But just to complicate things a little bit, we could also talk about an event like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Now, that was clearly a natural disaster in the sense that there was excessive heat, there was drought. Every single state in the United States, except for Maine and Vermont, got something like they were off about at least 15% on their annual rainfall. So it is a natural event, but then when you actually start to investigate more kind of how humans were interacting with the land, you come to question that. And Donald Worcester, who actually I just quoted from earlier, wrote a book about the Dust Bowl back in 1980. And what he said, in essence, was the Dust Bowl can't be blamed on illiteracy or overpopulation. It came about because the culture was operating in precisely the way it was supposed to. And the culture that he was talking about was essentially capitalism and market agriculture and all the incentives that farmers had, particularly in the decade around World War I, where wheat prices shot way up, to expand their operations, to borrow money for machinery, and to go into these marginal areas on the Great Plains and plow them up. And one of the things, again, that I don't have the link to, but you can find it on archive.org, is the Père Lorenz movie called The Plow That Broke the Plains. And that is very short, and it actually was footage that was taken during a dust storm in the 1930s, and I show that a lot because students can get a real sense of it. And then it also goes into some of the causes and consequences of it. So the Dust Bowl is, I think, one of those great examples of something that's a natural phenomena, but humans have had such an intervention in it that they've made matters for themselves a lot worse. So that's kind of one of those interesting phenomena. The second aspect is the one that probably I spend the most time on, and that's essentially the way that the environment has come to be used for economic purposes. And so, like an obvious example, like the Glen Canyon Dam, you know, it's there for irrigation, it's there for power, you know, it's nature being controlled, nature being harnessed in this kind of way for economic purposes. And I think you could explore with your students a lot of different aspects of that. Again, using your town is a good example. You certainly could talk about the development of agriculture, and I'm going to talk a little later about food systems, which is sort of part of agriculture, and the fact that in New England, you know, the European settlement dates from the 1600s, but even native people before that were farming in this valley and were clearing land in this valley. So it's important when you're talking about the earliest farms to not just start with the English, but to mention the fact that, in fact, native people were growing corn and other crops. And of course, part of the shaping of the land was the way that the land was divided. And this is the plot map for Deerfield in the 17th century. And what's interesting is a flyover, and again, I should have had the date on this photograph, but an aerial photograph not that long ago. And you can see that the pattern in the field still is there. And again, that's a really dramatic thing that you can show students about how the way that things were laid out back 300 years ago still has an impact on the land that we see today. And again, just to come back to the theme, the reason for this is economics. It's all about economic purposes. It's not like they're trying to follow a natural contour or anything like that. When we talk about the economic use of nature, we also should be talking about labor. And of course, you already probably do that when you talk about, for example, plantations before the Civil War, or sharecropping after the Civil War, migrant labor today. And it's really important that when we think about environmental history, we think about the people and not just the land itself, and the way that society's organized to put people to work. And again, agricultural labor is an obvious example of that you can bring up with students. Irrigation, another one, obviously, that relates to food systems. That dam that I showed in the very first picture is all part of what was going on in the West, primarily in the late 19th and all the way through the 20th century, to try to take a fundamentally arid region and to, well, initially it was to make it hospitable for homesteaders. The Bureau of Reclamation Act of 1902 was involved with that. And very quickly, it turned out that the water was going to private landowners in the West. It wasn't really going in this kind of equally distributed way. But again, coming back to this issue, the history of irrigation and water use is like really important in terms of agriculture. And it really, again, has a lot to do with how the environment gets shaped. Transportation, obviously, that's part of the food system idea. And you have farmers who are, the value of land is determined essentially by how much access to transportation it has. And that's true actually all the way back in the colonial period. That the interior of Massachusetts, the area around Petersham or Central Mass, got settled relatively late because it had really poor transportation compared to the Connecticut Valley, which had an outlet down the Connecticut River, or of course the eastern part of Massachusetts. And those of you who teach history of populism and agrarian movements know that the railroad played a big role in that. And that's, again, part of the environment when we think about it. And then, of course, distribution. And the fact that for most students today, the food that they're eating comes from a pretty good distance away from where they live. Not all their food, but some of it. And, well, depending on who they are, maybe more or less of it. Some of you might already know this, but in fact, Swift developed the system for disassembling hogs, this kind of assembly line. And when Henry Ford saw it, this was essentially where he got the idea to create an assembly line, was out of the disassembly line that the slaughterhouses had. And just the idea that all of a sudden meat becomes a brand name that could be marketed in competition with local foods. And again, this is something that can be discussed because it starts way back. It starts in, the turn of the 20th century. Some of you probably have students reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Well, here's sort of the environmental context of that, about food processing and distribution. And then, of course, you can have students looking at what's going on today in where they eat and how they eat. Again, around here, what's interesting is there's been sort of this counter movement toward local foods. And I think that when you're dealing with environmental history and food distribution, you have to take into account the fact that there's been this kind of really interesting change that's happened just really in the last few years. And it hasn't caught on, in terms of the whole national food system. But at the same time, I think it's, for your students, it's made a really significant impact. And it's something they can talk about, like whether or not their food comes from nearby, whether their food comes from far away, and what are the historical circumstances that led to one versus the other. We talk about economic uses of nature. The obvious one, besides agriculture, is extractive industries like chopping down trees. This is Mount Monadnock, somewhere around the mid-19th century. And as you can see, it was not forested, but in fact, largely harvested. And actually, also, there were quite a few sheep that were grazing there as well. Not all that successfully, ultimately, but this has a huge impact on the land. And of course, the Pacific Northwest, where old-growth forest was being cut down in the late 19th century, is an even more dramatic example of the economic uses of nature and extractive industries. I show this picture a lot, and I ask students to caption it. And, well, how would you caption this picture?
A lot of logs.
A lot of logs, that's for sure.
It looks like I know it's not a train, but it looks like a train.
Post-finance.
Well, it actually is kind of like a train probably pulling it.
I know, but is it long?
Yeah, the train isn't it's there. Yeah.
Snakes in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, well, for the students who know the Bible, they might say that. but yeah.
If they read Shakespeare, they might know.
Oh, that's true too, for sure. But, you know, they'll talk about destruction or clear cutting. This is the way that, you know, they see the scene. And when I tell them that this would have been captioned progress in the 19th century, that gets them thinking about this whole issue of what is progress and how the taking of natural resources and bringing them into the marketplace and making some kind of economic use out of them was really kind of at the center of the American experience with nature. Extractive industries also could be like gold mining. And our image of gold mining is usually the lone prospector, but in fact, in California, there was quite a bit, fairly soon after the discovery of gold, of something called hydraulic mining, where they would be washing away whole hillsides in order to get the gold and sluice it. And this became so controversial because it would put silt into the rivers, which really prevented the farmers from getting land. And one of the first environmental battles actually happened in California in the late 19th century about that issue of hydraulic mining. And of course today, students will think about strip mining. And it's sort of the same idea of these really dramatic transformations that we do to the land to extract resources from it. The third, well, another economic use of nature that again, I think will come to the students pretty quickly is the idea of power and energy. And particularly, of course, water power, because in New England, we have industrialization that was started with a lot of water-powered textile mills and other things. And of course, there's tons of things that you can do with that. This is a bird's eye view of Holyoke. And you can see the canal system, you can see the dams, you can see how it was a planned industrial city all around the idea of getting the maximum amount of water power to the various mills that were built along the canal. So that's a really obvious economic use of nature that students can investigate. And of course, later on, the use of coal power for industry, and particularly coal power that's used to generate electricity. And right now, as you know, there's a lot of debates about whether or not to shut down coal plants in Massachusetts entirely. And so that again has a contemporary resonance to it. And then of course, the coming of nuclear power, which started in the 1950s. And this woman is posing with her electric grill, and there's the nuclear power plant in the background from the 1950s. And in those days, electricity was considered that in the future it would be too cheap to even meter. And so all the structures that you see from the 1950s, 1960s, the house that I live in, the 1969 split level, you know, had electric heat in the ceiling, right? Because the idea was you didn't have to think at all about energy efficiency and electricity at all. And then, of course, the real extractive industry that is in the headlines is oil. And this is from 1910, and it shows offshore oil drilling in between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles. But I think pretty much all of your students within their own short living memory will remember the BP oil spill. And this becomes, again, a really interesting way to talk about nature and what's the price that gets paid for the economic uses of nature and profit and that kind of thing. And you get into really interesting debates in class about, if you're driving a car, are you responsible for this? And different kinds of interesting discussions. The other thing that, again, we're still talking about economic uses of nature and sort of utilitarian uses, is housing and transportation. And this is very much part of environmental history. And you can again start in the mid-19th century where the first planned suburbs start. And this is Frederick Law Olmsted, who's better known for Central Park. But he also designed the suburb of Chicago called Riverside. And the whole development is basically along the train tracks. It's also significant that the streets in Riverside are curved. And if you think about what had happened before, everything was on a straight grid in the Midwest. You fly over the Midwest, it still has this checkerboard pattern from the Northwest Ordinance, really, 1787. But the curved things were thought to be much more appropriate for domestic life, more bucolic. Where did he get the idea for that? Well, rural cemeteries. And in fact, Mount Auburn Cemetery and some of the other cemeteries were the first places within metropolitan areas to have these curvilinear streets, which then later got adapted. I mean, first, in a sense, the dead were moved out of center cities and planted in cemeteries that had these curved structures, and then ultimately living people came and followed them to live in the same kinds of places. A lot noisier though. And then, again, the world that your students are currently in is the world of superhighways and suburban housing. And this lower right picture, of course, is Levittown. And in the 1950s, there were 3 Levittowns that actually were built. One in Long Island that kept the name Levittown, one in Pennsylvania, and another in New Jersey. It was just amazing how fast the houses could go up. Mass production techniques allowed that to happen. And so it leads to this really interesting question about how close together should people be living. And back, say in the 1960s, when I was kind of coming of age, we would say, oh, these suburbs are not very environmentally sustainable. But when you look at how closely packed Levittown is, you realize that that's actually pretty good compared to some of the exurbs that have been built, particularly since the 1970s and 1980s. And that some of the earliest suburbs, going all the way back to the 19th century and even after World War II, really were fairly efficient in their use of land compared to what came later. So I talked about sort of this first aspect of environmental history, which is the how nature changes by itself, more or less. And we said that there's certain caveats to that. And then the second is the economic uses of nature. And the third aspect of environmental history that I talk about, and I kind of have this all integrated in, is environmental perception. And the fundamental premise that I have is that the way that societies shape nature is really a reflection of how they perceive nature in the first place. This picture, which dates from the early 17th century, is picturing Virginia. And as you can see, I don't know if people in the back can see the image very well. I was going to ask you to pick it out. But the place is overrun with fowl and animals. The birds are just like diving to get within range of the hunters. And this whole thing was a very much not like a realistic picture, but it was a promotional picture. It was telling Europeans that if they came to this North America, they would be able to, have this land of abundance. And this was abundant natural resources like wood, obviously, food, and ultimately land. And this was a perception that people had. And of course, part of that perception was that the land was more or less uninhabited when Europeans came, that the native people were fated to disappear. And again, that's a matter of perception. That's not a matter of reality. But people took that perception, and then in trying to push the native people further and further west or exterminate them, they kind of were making that into a reality. And again, when we think about the westward movement, it's highly imagined. This is the famous picture called Westward Ho, and you can see the goddess like stringing a telegraph, and everybody kind of heading out, and of course the Indians are kind of just being chased in front. And again, this is a perception. It was a perception, manifest destiny. It's a perception that the land was predetermined by divine providence, really, divine promise, to be delivered to the American people. And then that idea really became something that people acted on when they were moving west. So even though we can talk about the economic forces that drive people, there was also kind of this ideological vision that was there. And you might say that the vision was kind of in service of those economic interests that people had. But when we talk about ideas of nature and environmental perception, I think what's very interesting to look at is kind of the counter movement to thinking of the environment as just an economic resource. And what we're looking at, of course, is the picture that Thomas Cole painted in 1836 of the oxbow, which is just down the river. And this picture kind of I'm using to represent the whole romantic landscape painting tradition that came in the early 19th century. And I have students in my environmental history classes actually write about these works of art, because I want them to kind of think about what are the ideas of nature that are sort of embedded there. And of course, Cole is best known for painting these wild scenes in the Catskills. And the left half of this picture, of course, is the wild. It's kind of a romantic. But then when you look on the right side, you can see a very domesticated, farms and kind of a pastoral landscape. And here's where, I should have mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the documents that I'm going to be talking about are available online from mostly the Library of Congress has a website called the Evolution of the Conservation, which you can get from American Memory. And I didn't take the time to do a screenshot of it, but it's very easy to find. Under the Library of Congress, it's called the Evolution of the Conservation. And there are a lot of documents there. This particular document isn't, but it's also available really easily online. Thomas Cole, at about the same time that he was painting the oxbow, wrote this essay on American scenery. And it's a very short document, and for 19th century writing, pretty accessible for high school students. And this is just like a segment of it. And the famous passage where he talks about the ravages of the axe, and this sort of lament for how civilization is, destroying trees and doing all these things. But what's interesting is the way he ends this. Right? This is a regret rather than a complaint, such as the road society has to travel. It may lead to refinement in the end, but the traveler who sees the place of rest close at hand dislikes the road. And so he's not saying that this progress has to stop. He's saying just the opposite, that it's inevitable that we're going to be going from this side of the picture to that side of the picture. But that doesn't mean that we can't look back at the woods with a sense of loss and regret. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction, speaking of going backward. And so there's a lot of writing that's associated with these artists that you could then use. Obviously, the pictures are the best source, and almost all of these Hudson River artists are accessible online and are really good assignments for students to look at. Again, this notion that ideas of nature have consequences in the physical environment, that fairly soon after Cole painted his picture, a guy named Barrett took that same image and sort of ripped it off and put it into a tourist book about touring the Connecticut Valley. And you can see that in the upper picture here. And as you know, if you go up to the top of Mount Holyoke today, Skinner Mountain, there's a summit house. And hopefully it'll be open, I think maybe not until the fall. But it was restored and then it kind of fell apart now that it's being restored. But again, it's a very good example locally of how kind of a tourist economy developed, and this idea that nature was not just something for economic use, but it was scenery that you could be enjoying, that would have some kind of restorative quality for your soul. Again, from the early 19th century. And so you can definitely, have that kind of discussion with students about how they feel when they're out in nature. And then, of course, that sentiment leads to the creation, ultimately, of things like national parks. And this is an early picture of tourists at Old Faithful in Wyoming. And when you read descriptions of travelers' accounts from this period, which some of them are online and they're really fun, you find out that, like, in the hot, not the geysers, I guess, but sort of the hot thermal pools, people were putting soap in and they were doing their wash. I mean, it was, let's just say they were interacting with the resource in a way that the National Park Service doesn't allow today. But it's interesting, again, to think about, again, this nature as being something that's more for leisure than for work. And then, of course, the other thing that begins to happen when we talk about ideas of nature is we can start to talk about philosophers who are really writing specifically on the subject of humans' interaction with the natural world. And in Massachusetts, that means Thoreau. And there's a lot of different things from Thoreau that you can read. Everything that Thoreau wrote is online. There's a digital Thoreau website. And actually, the Library of Congress site has his essay, Walking, which is a nice short essay for students to read. It doesn't take very long to get through it. And that's where he's got this phrase, among others, in Wildness is the Preservation of the World, where he actually is talking about this value of the wild. And there's a lot that is in that phrase, because he's not saying wilderness is the preservation of the world, but he means wildness. And wildness is this quality that potentially you can have anywhere. You can even have it like in downtown Northampton. It's like a spiritual quality. But it was commonly thought that in order to kind of exercise that spiritual quality, you needed to have the outdoors in which to do it. And Thoreau, of course, is the one who, even though during his lifetime wasn't such a popular guy, eventually became really kind of one of the key people that I think anybody who is interested in Americans' relationship with nature has to read or come to terms with. I assigned Thoreau in my classes in college because I've discovered by asking students that a lot of them never got any Thoreau in high school, which actually surprised me. But it probably doesn't surprise you if you're teaching high school. So I think that, again, just even a little bit of exposure can be very provocative and help people to think about their kind of general cultural inheritance about that. A figure who is writing just a little bit after Thoreau, who's not very well known, but is very, very important, is George Perkins Marsh. And Marsh was the ambassador to Italy, believe it or not. He was from Vermont. And you can actually visit his house, which is 2 hours north of here, in Woodstock, Vermont. It's now a national park site, Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historic Site. The other two names are because Frederick Billings from the Northern Pacific Railroad bought the house, and then ultimately Lawrence Rockefeller did. So that's why it has three names. But Marsh was looking at the deforestation that was taking place in Europe and around the Mediterranean, and was picturing that this was also going to be happening in the northeastern United States because of all the deforestation. And so in Man and Nature, which he wrote in 1864, among other things he's writing, man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned to discords. You know what, I think that I missed the, I'm just gonna do this because I pasted this in, oh crap, excuse me. I pasted this in and I realized that I didn't paste it in with the full quote, which is not good. So let me just fix that. Well, I don't want to take the time to do that, to be honest. Maybe it's not worth it. So essentially, he's saying wherever man goes, nature is overthrown. And again, this is on the Library of Congress website, the evolution of the conservation movement. And he's really the first person who is issuing a warning about that the overuse of the natural resources for economic purposes, in fact, is not sustainable. That Americans can't keep it up forever, and that ultimately it's going to result in soil erosion, it's going to result in the lack of resources for the future. And so Marsh is often seen as kind of like the pivotal figure in the conservation movement in America, even though, again, not a lot of people were paying attention to him right at the time. It would take a generation before that would happen. In talking about ideas of nature, the other person who I always make sure to include in my course is Aldo Leopold, who's writing a little later. He's writing in the 1930s. His famous book, Sand County Almanac, is published in 1949 after his death. But one of the things that Leopold talks about is a land ethic, where he says that instead of humans kind of enslaving nature, that we should be in a community with nature. And the particular view that he's associated with, today we would call biocentrism. The idea that rather than nature being all there just for human purposes, that in fact nature has its own independent existence. And that biodiversity is really important as a value for us to be promoting in the natural world. So Leopold is really one of the key thinkers on this issue about sustainability, along with Marsh, writing almost 100 years earlier. Anyway, the fourth area, because I realize I'm going on a little too long here. The fourth area is actually environmental politics and public policy. And again, this is what you might think of when you think of environmental history. It's the history of the environmental movement. And so what was going on in the early 20th century, for example, with Theodore Roosevelt. And this is the one place where kind of your ordinary US history course intersects with environmental history really very directly, and probably a lot of you make that connection. And I want to just briefly talk about Gifford Pinchot, who was the Secretary of the Interior at one point. Actually, he's Chief of the Forest Service, the first Chief of the US Forest Service. And Pinchot, again, on the Library of Congress website, talks about, in this book that's on there called The Fight for Conservation, the principles of conservation. And all of these, I think, are really valuable for classroom discussion. The first one is development. And Pinchot believed that natural resources have to be used for the benefit of the people who are here now. And that statement, of course, would not be very much out of sync with all that we've talked about before when we talk about the economic uses of nature. His second principle also is really important. This notion that conservation really stands for efficiency and the prevention of waste. And even today, when people talk about conservation, they think that, well, you know, if we can do things more efficiently, we don't have to change our lifestyles. We can continue to get more output from the dwindling amount of input that we have when it comes to natural resources. But it's really the third thing here that's so important, actually a fourth thing, which I want to talk about. And that is that the natural resources were something that should be in the public domain and developed for the many and not really for the profit of the few. And he summarized his ideas really in this statement, which you can find again on that website. Conservation means the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. And that's kind of an interesting starting off point to talk about issues of sustainability. And one of the responsibilities that the current generation has when it comes to resources for future generations. And again, Pinchot was talking about this historically, you know, way back, over 100 years ago. Now, again, one of the other ways that I teach, besides, I've given you sort of these four rather general frameworks, talking about you know, how nature changes on its own, how economic uses of nature, ideas of nature, and then laws and public policy. Those are the four sort of general categories. But the thing is, you can use these case studies and have students sort of teasing those themes out of particular stories. And the one that is really very accessible, because it's very well documented on the Evolution of the Conservation Movement website that the Library of Congress has, is the controversy over building a dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. And essentially, this is the Hetch Hetchy Valley as it looked, say, in the early 1900s. And Yosemite was already a national park. And when we think about Yosemite Valley, that's one valley, but there was this other valley that was there. And the city of San Francisco was looking around for a stable water supply, particularly after the fires that happened after the earthquake of 1906. And ultimately, Congress allowed them to dam the river, I think it's the Merced River there, and to create a reservoir there for their water supply. But this set off this amazing public outcry. This is the law granting the use of Hetch Hetchy to the city of San Francisco. And again, on the website, there are all these flyers, Yosemite against corporate greed, let everyone help to save Hetch Hetchy Valley. It's signed by John Muir. John Muir is a nature writer who, again, is also really important in terms of what he wrote, but he's also the founder of the Sierra Club. And again, it's sort of a model for talking about environmental activism. And there was a strong letter writing campaign to try to get Congress to not make this decision, to reverse the decision. Muir wrote in the middle of this debate talking about the people who wanted to dam the Hetch Hetchy River. And again, you know, you can read that quote, putting it in this real religious terms. And this is, again, kind of this turning point where I asked my students, actually, I have a blackboard because I'm kind of old-fashioned, you know, and usually I can find a piece of chalk at UMass, not always. And I actually just do a poll. I ask every student, like, whether or not they would dam the river or not after they read the case. Because a lot of students believe, correctly, maybe, that the welfare of those citizens of San Francisco outweighs the few people who ultimately would come to the Hetch Hetchy Valley and see it. And that was certainly the argument that Gifford Pinchot made when he was in favor of damming the Hetch Hetchy Valley. He said, in fact, you know, the greatest good for the greatest number. And of course, Muir, you know, took the view that every unique part of God's creation needed to be preserved. And this is a picture for shortly after the dam was built. And so, you know, today it's flooded, even though there's a movement right now to try to remove that dam. I think it's probably a silly movement in certain ways, but as you can see, by 24 this year, the 100th anniversary of Muir's death, they wanted to drain the reservoir and restore the valley to its original splendor. Well, of course, if they got rid of the dam, all that would be at the bottom of the valley is all this muck and sediment, and it would not look like what was there before. But that's a whole different issue.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So something like the dam or the Quabbin Reservoir,
That's another great example.
where then, you know, transform the environment, and then a whole other natural ecosystem evolves from that man-made. So if we were to drain the Quabbin at this point in time, we would destroy a whole animal habitat.
That's right.
So where does that come into play in thinking about environmentalism and what we're preserving, what we're, I don't know,
No, it's a great question. I asked that exact same question of my students because I have them looking at. But what I have students doing is I usually have a group of students, and I have them do an environmental history of the town of Enfield, and most of them don't know what Enfield was, and I give them a map from the 1870s and 1880s, and it looks like just this ordinary town. And so the first part of their papers, they're writing about that ordinary town. And then when they trace it forward and they see what happens to it, we get into this interesting question of, well, is the land better off or worse off? Because now, like you say, it's a natural habitat. If the Quabbin wasn't there, probably you would have like the Route 9 sprawl, like you have in Hadley, going all the way through, you know, connecting this area with Worcester, going right through that area.
and could you make a similar, I mean, I don't really know this valley, but could you make a similar analogy if it were drained? Has it evolved into a whole natural habitat and life system?
You're talking about the Quabbin?
And now that had
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, because it's a water supply, there's all this very strict protection all around it.
but I mean,
Yeah.
now you could get environmentalists on both sides of the issue. We want to preserve the wildlife that is now associated with this valley that's been flooded.
Right.
So what is environmentalism in that case? Where you've got, you know, the originalist, for lack of a better word, versus the current state of being.
Yeah. No, I think that what's fun about bringing this into your teaching is because there are all these debates that don't really have questions, but they're questions that don't really have one answer, but they really stir some very deep kind of philosophical debates. And, you know, one of the ones, I want to make sure I don't run way over time because I realize I have way too much material, but the very first thing that I talked about was this notion of change that nature happens on it, would happen on its own. Well, in 2000, scientists wrote a really interesting, very provocative article talking about how we've now entered the age of the Anthropocene as opposed to Holocene and all this. And what he's saying is essentially that humans now are a force that affects the climate and everything around it. So that even the most remote area, like Antarctica, is now affected by human action. And so, in a way, there's no more wild nature. That it's all areas that humans have, in one way or another, affected and continue to affect. And this has some amazingly profound implications to it when you think about it. Because, again, this whole separation that is part of the Romantic movement of like Thomas Cole and others, saying that there's nature out there and humans are destroying nature. Well, all of a sudden now it's become like we're shapers, we're responsible. We're the natural force in a way. And again, students, I think most Americans kind of haven't wrapped their head around that quite yet. But I think for students, it's especially interesting to explore that. And I don't know if I have time to go into it, but I do have a sort of a little unit that I do about climate change, where we look at the history and the ways that that has some implications. Oh, this is just sort of, somehow the slide's duplicated, sorry about that. Let me just present, I don't want to go on forever, but another kind of little case study thing that you could do really easily with students. Because, again, the Library of Congress website has that. And that is, during World War II, the amount of miles that was driven domestically dropped by about 1/3. And that was because gasoline was essentially rationed for civilian use, and it was used for the war effort. And the federal government had this amazing campaign to try to get people to stop driving. And obviously the gasoline rationing is interesting in itself, but there'd be posters, for example. They've got more important places to go than you. Save rubber, well, that's just telling you to check your tires. But this one, right? Should brave men die so you can drive? And when I see this image, all I can think of is the war in Iraq, And in fact, that issue is still with us in some ways about, what are the lengths that we're going to in order to maintain our lifestyle. But it's interesting, again, that the federal government would put something like that out. You can't imagine them doing that today. Or my favorite, actually, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, which is telling people, of course, that they should have a carpool. So, again, it's interesting for students because I don't think they're ever in their lifetime have seen the federal government embark on that kind of very aggressive kind of campaign telling people to change their lifestyle. And I always use this as an example of how dramatically people were able to do it in a relatively short amount of time, because I think it gives people a little bit of optimism when they're talking about adapting to climate change and some of the things that we're adapting to today. How much more time should I go on for? 5 minutes? Okay, I have some things that I think I can show pretty quickly that I also do, and that is the other really interesting question historically is if Americans were so conscious of conservation during World War II, and especially even before the Depression, when there was so much scarcity and people didn't want to waste things. So what happened right afterward? And why do we have the kind of disposable lifestyle that we have? And again, online, there's quite a bit of really interesting advertising from that period. This is, if I can get this to, oh, I need to go on the internet. Is there an easy way to do that?
Yeah, there's a wireless password over on the wall.
Oh, I'm sorry, I should have done that before I came in. Let me just, I don't know how to do this, but
So there should be
for development.
the password is PROF.
Okay, good. Yeah, I should be able to. Sorry about that. Forgot to do this. Now you can tell students that Americans are in love with the automobile. Oops. But this is a film that General Motors did in 1956. And it kind of, it's an industrial film, but it's on YouTube. Oh, I forgot to plug in the sound part. I forgot there's even sound with this. The sound's really not that important, but you may as well have it. Yeah, you're right.
The Manifest Destiny Westford movie.
To control tower, we are about to take off on the highway of tomorrow. Stand by.
Is this the film that the Disney people wrote with the government for Tomorrowland and all that stuff?
No,
For
it's
the World's
not.
Fair?
No, it's not, but it's similar kind of idea. What's interesting is that this more or less came to pass. I mean, they got the music wrong for what the music was going to be in the future. But General Motors, before the Interstate Highway Act, is already predicting kind of what American life was going to be like. And we more or less followed that. I mean, you know.
Kind of did. Broadway musical. It sounds like Phantom of the Opera.
This is called Design for Dreaming. And it was an industrial film that General Motors put out for pretty much for dealers in the 1950s. And that's just an excerpt from it. And you don't want to see the whole thing, probably, because I don't want to show it. Where do I want to go? Let me just do this again real quickly. Oops. That's what I wanted to do. The other thing in the 1950s was disposable products.
No Pampers. Pampers. I was thinking of trying.
And you can download commercials now from archive.org.
Pampers Susan wore when she was born were good, but these Pampers stay twice as dry. Twice as dry? Sure. Wet both and wait. Quilted Pampers stay twice as dry. Dryer's gotta feel better. Sure does. And that advice is on the house.
Quilted Pampers stay twice as dry as before.
So, the whole notion of using disposable products.
Harvey,
This one, I'm sorry, this isn't disposable, but it's just outrageous.
You're kidding. I'm serious, honey. Your coffee's undrinkable.
pretty harsh.
Well, so's your coffee. You know, the girls down at the office make better coffee on their hot plate. Well, see you later.
Goodbye. You know, if I could just make a decent cup of coffee, I could relax. So, relax. Why don't you try instant Folgers? Tastes good as fresh perk. Good as fresh perk. I'll surprise Harvey for his birthday tonight.
Hey, great coffee.
Instant Folgers. Doesn't it taste good as fresh perk?
Better.
Better than those girls make at the office?
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Now,
Instant Folgers tastes good as fresh perk.
now I use that ad because, of course, it's for consumption, but clearly you could use it to talk about gender or all kinds of things. I don't know if I'm going to show this one, but
Show it.
this one is. This would totally surprise yourself.
Yeah? I hate to see them work so hard. Yeah, me too. Let's go around back where we can't see them. Gee, we ought to do something, Fred. Okay? How's about taking a nap? I got a better idea. Let's take a Winston break. That's it! Winston is the one filter cigarette that delivers flavor 20 times a pack. Winston's got that filter blend. Yeah, Fred. Filter blend makes the big taste difference, and only Winston has it up front where it counts. Here, ahead is a pure white filter. Winston packs rich tobaccos specially selected and specially processed for good flavor in filter smoke. Yeah, Barney, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. The Flintstones has been brought to you by Winston, America's best-selling, best-tasting filtered cigarette. Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
What was the year on that one?
Well, it must have been the early 60s.
Yeah, I remember watching it.
But I show this because, first off, most students have never seen a cigarette commercial.
Right.
But then secondly, they don't know that the Flintstones were selling something before they were selling vitamins.
Yeah.
And then the obvious thing for older people is this whole debate about whether or not cigarettes were ever marketed to kids. Well, this is kind of like the smoking gun, so to speak. It shows, in fact, they work, right? So, anyway, so you can have students think about, well, not so much about smoking, but thinking about the whole notion of a mass consumption lifestyle. And I've got more, but I think maybe I want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion and things. The last part, really, I think, was talking more about well, the modern environmental regulations, and I think, you know, I won't go into that, but it's important to understand that, in fact, the environment has gotten cleaner in so many ways than it has 50 years ago because of the laws that were passed in the early 1970s. This is a cartoon from the Worcester Telegram in 1965, talking about how messy the Miller's River was, and since I'm into video, this I can show this too, which hopefully will be kind of obvious. Maybe you've showed this in your class already.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
Again, sort of this notion of There we go. That's what I wanted to do. The guy who was the Indian there, by the way, was not native, but was Sicilian. You may know that, but it was interesting. Well, because in the movies, he played an Indian in the movies going all the way back to the 30s, Iron Eyes Cody, and in those days they didn't use native actors, so they would use Italians to play the Indians pretty regularly. Sort of interesting footnote about movie history. So, again, what I emphasize with students is the fact that the environmental laws of the 70s actually made a difference. This is when they took lead out of gasoline, and you can see the dramatic decrease in the amount of lead that is in the atmosphere. Then again, the last thing is climate change, but I think I don't want to talk about that because I think I'd rather have more time for discussion. Unless I'm wondering if I can do that quickly.
Well, if you want, if people are sort of anxious to get something to eat,
yeah,
we could sort of open that up, and then how do people feel about that?
If food is the next thing,
like,
then I don't...
having something to eat and then kind of just having sort of a Q&A while people are eating, is that sort of a thumbs up idea? Okay, all right, well, let's do that then.
We can wrap it up while we unwrap this.
Well, the last thing, this is something that I have a hard time talking about with students because they don't really want to deal with it. And that is this issue of climate change. And again, when we talk about that, I'm sure that in the science courses, they're getting a lot of facts about it, and hopefully, this is one of my favorite quotes from former Senator Marsh. And there's no question when you actually look at the science that there's this projection of a really different world in the next 50 years even because of this. And I'm not going to go through the science of it, but the evidence is there, and students may notice that in different ways in the news reports of glaciers being smaller, wildfires in the West like we're having right now, floods like Hurricane Katrina, which was just a few years ago, or for that matter, Hurricane Irene, which was again in this area not that long ago. And I gave a presentation in Boston at Boston Double Islands National Park, and they asked me to talk about climate change, which I thought was kind of interesting for a national park, but given that that particular park would be underwater if the ocean rises, they thought it was relevant. And so there's some really interesting, I don't know if you want to do this with students, but some interesting projections about if the ocean rises, how much of Boston will go underwater. But the part that I want to emphasize usually is the global aspects, the fact that this is happening and there's a possibility of refugees. So if you think that we've got an immigration issue now, it'll be even greater as certain parts of the world become not habitable. I also asked the students to think about these questions about who's going to pay for mitigating, or who's going to pay for adapting to climate change. And again, these environmental justice questions about whether poor people, people of color, tend to be in the way of some of these things more than other people. Actually, this is not all that relevant, but this part is. The idea that if you have certain resources that are located by the coast, which ones do you save and which ones do you essentially abandon to the sea, and who makes that decision? And this is a big issue for historic preservation. That's where history comes into this. And then kind of the last thing that what I want to end with is really what I do my research on now, which is this notion that thinking about sense of place and the way people adapt to their environment and their sense of history. And how is that going to be when your students will ask their grandparents about the weather and it'll be radically different, or your students' grandchildren, or whatever. But this whole notion that the change that's taking place is somehow unsettling. And you might ask students, like, how many of your parents talk about that the weather isn't what it used to be, but they don't really know why. And then if you think about what historians can contribute to this, we could be telling these stories of collapse and warning, like, the Anasazi, or I should say Puebloan ancestor civilizations in the Southwest that overused their resources, and then when there was a drought, they had to basically move. I don't like that story particularly because it's a very doomsday type story. We could tell stories of sustainability about how these societies, particularly ones in the distant past, native people lived in harmony with nature. But again, I don't think that's necessarily a useful story for us to tell either, given that we're kind of on this path right now that we're on, economically and otherwise. So what I'm suggesting is that we use environmental history to tell stories of resilience, about how people bounce back from the Dust Bowl, how they bounce back from other kinds of environmental and other kinds of catastrophes. Because I think that that probably is the most empowering kind of way that we can present climate and other kinds of issues to students, is to talk about how past civilizations have overcome some of the challenges that they faced. And we, as historians, are naturally predisposed, I think, to talk about continuity. But, how things in the past kind of continue on into the present. But I'm wondering, again, whether a more useful thing to talk about is contingency in the past, about how things in the past were really unpredictable, and they could have gone in any different direction, and human action kind of pushed them in one direction or another. Because I think, again, that's a much more empowering kind of story about history that we can be telling. And this larger question of, like, what's it mean to live in a world where, literally the environment is changing faster than we can understand it. And, the writer Terry Tempest Williams talks about finding refuge in change, which is kind of a deep philosophical concept, but I think that it might be something that students may want to grapple with in certain kinds of ways. So anyway, that's kind of just and sorry to ramble on so long, but anyway.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.